Stephen, I've got to start
Good to
with
be
you.
back.
Let's start with Novak Djokovic. He's left the country. He's back in Serbia. Stephen, what do you make of how this was all handled?
Well, look, firstly, good riddance. Here's a bloke who tried to game the system, never had any intention to be vaccinated. And, you know, this was the right decision by both the government and by the courts. But let's be very clear, this has been a debacle. I mean, John Howard would never have got himself into the mess that Scott Morrison has got himself in. It just beggars belief that they let him in the country in the first place, that they allowed this process whereby he could claim a medical exemption under questionable grounds, never agreed to it in the first place. It's like they were in on the scam to get him into the country in the first place. So Morrison might have got the right outcome in the end, but my God, you know, when you compare him to John Howard, you just go, this bloke just is not a leader.
Michael, do you agree with that? And also, has this damaged Australia's reputation?
Oh, I've got no doubt it's damaged our reputation, but I love Stephen now praising John Howard. He's been bagging John Howard all of John Howard's political life. But anyway, he's sounding like Christina Keneally. I heard her utter all those words this morning. Look, the answer is Djokovic, of course, should have been vaccinated. The Minister, Alex Hawke, shout out to Alex Hawke, who did a great job in enforcing Australia's laws, and the Minister made the right decision. It was hard to overturn, as we've seen. The full court made the right decision, and you know, as Morrison said, the same rule should apply to everybody. So it's good that he's left the country, and if he wants to come back, he should be vaccinated. And the role of Tennis Australia, and this has also got to be investigated. But yeah, look, I've got no doubt it's damaged their reputation. I've just come back from overseas, and it was playing big time in those countries from the point of view that, you know, what are those awful Australians doing to wonderful Novak Djokovic? So they were taking the alternate view to what was happening in here because, you know, but they didn't get all the nuances of Australian border protection laws. So we were getting a bit of a caning in the US and in France and England, I'm afraid to say.
Okay, look, moving on to another issue. Businesses are struggling more than ever with this Omicron outbreak. Some say that this is tougher for them now than when we were in lockdown. Stephen, economists predict that Australia will bounce back quite quickly from this. Do you think, though, that the government needs to be bringing back more support?
Well, I think you've got two problems. So Josh Frydenberg went public a few days ago to say, look, there's no issues, Omicron's not going to cause a problem. And you've seen, I think, Deloitte Access Economics, Chris Richardson, say that instead of there being a 5.5% jump in GDP, it's going to be wound back to 4%. I don't know why, other than the pure political messaging that Josh has to do, where he's got to say everything's fine, no change, the economy's strong, rah, rah, rah. But every Australian knows you walk down to your supermarket at the moment, the meat shelves are empty. Many other goods in supermarkets aren't available. These supply-side shortages caused, once again, I'm afraid Michael's going to disagree with me, caused by
Morrison?
The complete lack of preparation and planning by this government because they didn't build a stockpile when they could last October when they were told they would need it. And the Transport Workers Union told them back in October, you will need these rat tests. They said, no need for these rat tests. We get to mid-January, you can't find one for less than $30, $40, $50, and we've got supermarkets with no meat. This is a first world country that this Prime Minister is running into the ground. It's just extraordinary.
Michael, why shouldn't rat tests be free?
Well, the answer to that simply is, I suppose, there's a limit to what the government can afford to pay for things. I mean, you know, everything should be free. They are free in other countries. They're free in the United States, I might add, but you have to pay for them in Britain. So there's a limit to whatever governments, you know, what
should they be free here?
Can afford to pay. We've got to. Well, everything else has been free, so I suppose there's no reason why they shouldn't be, Gabriella. You know, free PCR tests, you know, JobKeeper, etcetera, etcetera. The federal government has shouldered an enormous burden over the last 2 years. So yeah, look, in line with previous practice, perhaps they should be free, but the supply is the issue at the minute, as everybody knows. But look, this is not just a problem in Australia. I mean, Stephen talks about how terrible Scott Morrison is. He seems to be to blame for everything. You've got the same problem in the United States. You've got the same problem in France, the same problem in England. In all the Western world countries, they've got with the outbreak of this strain, you've got the same problems everywhere in the world. So to say that some particular problem with Scott Morrison is just laughable, and Stephen's better than it, quite frankly.
You mentioned JobKeeper there, Michael.
He was.
Stephen, do you think we should be bringing back JobKeeper or something similar, seeing as businesses are doing it so tough?
Yeah, look, I went to a restaurant in the city for lunch last week, and I walked in about 1:30, and the three waiters were just sitting playing cards. It was empty. And this is how they explained it to me. They said, when we were in lockdown, we had no revenue, no customers. We were obviously locked down, but we had government support to get us through. Today, we've got no revenue, no customers, and we don't have the government support. It's actually worse than it was during the lockdown. So I think there's a very strong case at the moment. The consumers are staying home, they're not spending, they're not getting out and about. I think there's a very strong case to be made for bringing back a form of JobKeeper, whether it was the weaker second version or the original version. But small businesses are screaming, this is worse than the lockdowns.
Do you agree with that, Michael? Should we be bringing back JobKeeper?
Well, I don't think so at this stage. To answer to all these problems, Gabrielle, as Stephen says and Labor say, spend more money, bring back JobKeeper, free, testing, antigen testing, etcetera, etcetera. I mean, that's sort of Labor's mantra. There's never been a government dollar that Labor have not wanted to spend. And I suppose the lesson out of this latest outbreak is that this is not, and all the worldwide views are the same, this is not a strain which is putting people into serious illness. Yes, there are people in hospital, there are people on ventilators, there are people dying, etc. But nothing like what was predicted. And for most people who get this strain, it's a mild form of flu, and which is why I think the New South Wales government, as usual, are ahead of the pack, basically saying, look, we've got to live with COVID and we can't continue to lock down the country. But Stephen is right in one sense that businesses are hurting badly, but I think the answer to that is to say, for governments to simply say, look, this is a form of flu, more serious in some people than others, and basically get people back to work. The days of closing down the whole state, the whole country, they've got to be over. They've got to be over.
Yeah.
They've got to be over.
Look, looking ahead at the federal election coming up this year, Stephen, what do you make of the government's proposed tax cuts?
Well, I think they've had to cost them up over the next 20 years to try and make them sound like they're real. I mean, Michael wants to talk about spending money. I mean, here's a government about to spend $20 billion odd that the country can't afford at the moment. So, I mean, Josh is just trying to come up with the standard Liberal Party pitch for the election. I think that the Australian people will see through this. They're not going to be interested when they, you can give them a tax cut, Josh, but if they can't buy meat at the supermarket, it really doesn't matter to them. So how about you focus on getting food into supermarkets? How about you focus on keeping aged care protected? I mean, right now in Australia, the government have just made a decision to allow what we're calling furloughed workers in the aged care sector not to go back to work and use a RAT test, except you can't get a RAT test. So all those people who've been at home isolating, who work in aged care, are now going back into aged care homes, and they have no idea whether or not they've got COVID or not. This is a recipe for a disaster. The government needs to get on top of this right now. They haven't mandated RAT be given to the aged care sector. This is going to be a disaster, and the government are going to suffer again for this.
Michael, tax is going to be a big issue at the election. Jim Chalmers says the coalition has taxed Australians at a much higher rate than Labor did. What's your response to this?
Well, it's one of the reasons that Josh Frydenberg and the government want to put money back into people's pockets. And why shouldn't they? Tax cuts should always be a major priority of any government, so long as it doesn't lead to long-term, structural deficits. That's the criticism at the minute, that we're so far away from having a surplus that it is adding to the structural deficit situation. But there's never anything wrong with giving people tax cuts and giving people back money. That should always be a priority of governments. It's always a priority of Liberal governments, not so much Labor. But the real issue facing the government is that there's not long to go till the election. My guess is, by the way, the election's on May the 21st. That would be my rough guess of when it would be. that leaves them only 4 months. Now, if you go back to the last election, Frydenberg and Morrison were really going headlong against the tax cuts in December, and they were making a lot of ground in the last half of December 18, first part of January 19. They haven't got anywhere near that momentum at the minute, for all the reasons we know. So they've only got 4 months to turn this whole debate around, this economic debate around, which I think will be the government saying, who do you trust and who do you trust to keep interest rates low? And that's the government's best hope of re-election, Gab.